This time the speaker is Prisca. Paul's voice had changed. His whole manner of speaking had changed. That snarling, aggressive, supercilious whine, that nasal screech of his, had softened into something almost introspective. He breathed more. He preached with less violence, less drama, less, what should I call it, gesticulation. He announced his themes at the beginning of a proper talk. Then he would pause now and again to collect his thoughts. The apostle was teaching now, leading people in a planned path, adhering to a self-conscious strategy. When had the change taken place? I didn't know. Whether it happened while he was gone from us or in the year of his return, I really didn't know. I didn't become completely aware of it, the difference in his voice, until the evening when he escorted Lydia to our house for dinner. Not until the moment he took my hand and said, "This is your mother." My mother? For the blink of an eye, I suffered the impossible thought that this was my mother suddenly restored to life, suddenly in my home again. Paul must have seen the shadow flit over my face. He squeezed my hand for attention and said, "Priscilla, your spiritual mother, the mother of your calling. It's because of this woman that you pray and prophesy in public." Now he did for me exactly what he'd done for his companion. He knelt in order to lower me onto my own cushion side by side with the older, larger woman. But the food, the dinner, as I was brought low, speechless, to the table, Aquila rose and quietly left the room. Paul took a seat facing the two of us. He smiled. "Prisca," he said, looking at the woman beside me, "this is Lydia, my steadfast friend and beloved to me, one of my dearest partners in the gospel since I entered Europe and traveled to Philippi." Lydia looked at Paul with complete familiarity, as if she were receiving some interesting pieces of information. Paul said, "Lydia trades in splendid cloth dyed purple in the vats of Thyatira. She's on her way to that city now to make purchases and to preach. It's her hometown, Prisca. She wants people to know the news." Lydia nodded agreement. Aristocratic, content to be praised. So that's why her robe was so expensive and so elegant. There was a bump at the door, and Aquila entered the dining room with my pigeons still in the baking dish, grease gurgling and spitting with heat. I doubted the meat was thoroughly cooked, but I kept quiet. My humble husband knows nothing of the sequence of meals and proper presentation, yet he had chosen to serve, and I determined to be as proud of him as if he were a lord of lands and lakes and magnificent holdings. Paul said, "Lydia's a Jew, like you, but unlike you, she's unmarried. In Philippi there is no synagogue, nor were there men enough to lead in prayers and readings and worship. So what did you do, Lydia? Tell Prisca what you were doing when I first met you." The woman beside me said, "You tell it much better than I." What a low, thrilling voice she had. Big as a bed, warm as a blanket. "You tell it much better than I." Paul grinned. Aquila left the room. "Prisca," Paul said, "Lydia led the worship herself, meeting on every Shabbat with other women by a stream outside the city. And after I baptized her, the good work that the Lord had begun in her did not cease. It will not cease until it's brought to completion in the day of Jesus Christ. Until Philippi, I never thought that women could or should utter sacred words in public places. But there in Philippi, I found the Spirit already working in this woman, working in power. How could I contradict the Spirit of God? How could I refuse to admit the evidence before my eyes? God chose the woman, not me. I had to accommodate myself to God. Something crashed in the kitchen. There followed a silence, and then I heard the slow, dragging strokes of the bramble broom as it pushed pottery and potsherds into a pile. The sweeping made a slushy sound. Yes, it had been the wine flask, alabaster, irreplaceable. I said, "So then it was not you, Paul, but God who chose me to prophesy?" He looked at me. God? Yes. To prophesy? Yes. Paul spoke in a studied, tutorial tone. To practice that spiritual gift, upbuilding the people, encouraging them, consoling them. Yes, Prisca, God chose you to edify the church. Oh, Paul, but I always thought it had been you. I thought you had approved of me, selected me, prepared me to join you preaching. This is more than I knew, I whispered, and less than I felt. Prisca, Paul said, piercing me with his red-rimmed eyes. Prisca, what does that mean? Lydia, too, turned toward me, mildly reflecting his question, sublimely expecting an answer. I blurted, "But you were the one who told me to cover my head. Why did you tell me to cover my head?" Aquila came into the room with 3 brutish clay cups already filled with wine. I noticed the lees turning and turning in mine. Then he sat, my husband did, as if the meal were spread and ready. I was not going to ask for bread. I was not going to mention the water for washing. Aquila had taken a seat by Paul. He was squinting hard in my direction. He who cannot see knows not how much he can be seen. In that moment, I loved Aquila to tears. Paul spoke again in that schoolish tone, having missed completely my deeper meaning. In this created world, he said, your head declares your source, and your face is the glory of that source and that authority. Your head, Paul said, is like the headwaters of the river. Being comes from it. So it is in the order of creation. The head of every man is Christ, the head of a woman is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. Paul paused to bethink himself. Oh, my smart apostle, deaf to the sense of his heart. He began to roll the rough clay cup between the palms of his hands. But when you pray, Prisca, Paul said, staring into his wine, when you prophesy, that act jumps the order of creation. The source of that gift is the Spirit of Christ. Its practice must give glory to none but Christ and God the Father, whom the angels make present in our worship. No glory to Aquila, none to your husband. It would dishonor him and offend heaven if anything signified that the prophecy came from him. So you must hide that which declares Aquila to be your source. You must cover him up, as it were. You must cover your head, Prisca, which signifies your earthly head. Smiling, mild, and undisturbed, Lydia of Thyatira now raised her hands and pulled out the pins that held her hair in place. She rolled her shoulders, she bent her head left and right as if it were in a cloud of rain upon the mountain. Her hair fell thick and beautiful. It covered her head all round. My veil, Priscilla, she murmured from behind the iron-gray rain. Or if I wanted to deny the veil, I might as well shear this off and go bald about the country, showing my head and my face in full. And what, Lydia, I said in my soul, does that mean? She called me Priscilla. No one had ever called me Priscilla before, not even Aquila, just Paul only. In the mouth of this woman, wealthy and powerful, the name lost all its tender affection. It became to me a great diminishment. Little Prisca, Prissy. Paul smiled at me. Paul, his own large head seeming loose on his narrow neck, grinned at me, cracking the flesh around his moist red mouth. He said, "I've told Lydia all about you, Prisca. She loves you. She's as proud of you as I am. It was her suggestion that we eat together before she leaves for Thyatira. She wants to learn from you. She wants you to teach her everything you know about the edification of the church. For though she may be your mother in ministry, you are the more mature, having practiced it the longer." I, too, smiled. I smiled at Paul. I smiled at Lydia as she divided the hair from her face, reappearing strong and jowlish. But on a sudden impulse, I rose to my feet and went to Aquila and knelt down behind him and draped my arms around his neck and kissed the hair on the crown of his head.